Welcome to the second part on key management. This lecture is about passwords, hardware, and biometrics. And the first question is maybe what have any of these things anything to do with key management? So the topic of key management is how to protect your key. I mean, a very big topic in key management is how to protect your key. The previous lecture, we saw how you can establish a key between parties. I can establish a connection between parties. We looked at key distribution centers and certificate authority, and in both cases, users, parties had to hold keys. A certificate authority has to keep their secret key in a very safe place. It's very important to keep this secret key safe so that people can't steal the secret key and then forge certificates on behalf of the certificate authority. Users need to keep their encryption keys secret from adversaries, otherwise adversary can trivially break the encryption schemes and the signature schemes. So it's really important to protect your keys. So how would you protect your key? Well, I mean, you could, of course, encrypt your key. But then how do you protect the keys that you use to encrypt your keys? And then you get into this problem of simply, where does this stop? The picture here is a stack of turtles on top of each other to remind you of the in the old days when people believed that the Earth was flat, and it was held on top of and there was a turtle below the Earth. On which the Earth was lying. Then of course the question is, but what's below the turtle? And then the answer is it's just turtles all the way, right? And this is a bit of the same with keys, right? So how do you keep your keys? How do you protect your keys? You can encrypt them with other keys, but then how do you protect these other keys? And then we get to this fact, this fact that there is nothing to do about, that is in bold here, and it's also in bold in the book, because it's really important to remember that any secure system using cryptography must at some point make use of one or more keys that are protected only by physical non-cryptographic means. So cryptography can take you a long way, but at the end of the day, there is the problem of where do you keep the key, or where do you keep the last key in this chain of keys. So here is why passwords, hardware, and biometrics become a useful tool. Those are tools that you can use to protect your keys. And I mean, when we talk about passwords, we're going to use this term in a broad sense. So we're just going to use passwords in general to be the term that refers as something you know. So we don't really care whether it's a password or a PIN code or some other secret but it's something that you know, something that a human knows and can store in their brain. Hardware is something that you have. So this is something that, to a greater degree, everyone is getting used to use in an everyday life. For instance, using your mobile phone as a device to receive SMS codes to validate credit card transactions. Your credit card itself, it's a hardware token, contains a chip, which is a hardware token, which allows you to do, which identifies you. I mean, you can imagine, the key you use to enter your car. It's some hardware that's something that you have, and that allows you to give you access to some resource. And then finally, you have biometrics. Biometrics here is a broad sense for something you are, and again, biometrics is also, to a much larger degree now than just a few years ago, something that has permeated everyday user experience. We are all getting used to unlock our mobile phones with our fingerprints or with our face. So biometrics for us is just a general term for something that you are. And through these slides, I'm going to have a few XKCD comics. If you don't know XKCD comics, I would definitely recommend this series of comics. It's a series of web comics which is quite nerdy and has a very and there's a few very good jokes about cryptography and security in general. So here in this comic, you can see the crypto nerd's imagination that his laptop is encrypted. Let's build $1 million cluster to crack it, says one of the two hackers, and then the other hacker says, oh, that's not good, that's a 4096 bit RSA, which, as you actually know from the confidentiality week, it's a very good length for an RSA keys, and therefore it's virtually unbreakable, and therefore the first hacker says, blast, our evil plan is foiled. And on the right side, instead, you see, what would actually happen, and its laptop is encrypted. Drag him and hit him with this $5 range until he tells us the password got it. And the point of this comic is that really the things that we're looking at today, passwords, hardware, biometrics, are often the weakest links when cryptography is being used. So it does happen, but it's quite rare that cryptography is broken. I mean, there are a few hackathon stories of cryptographic algorithms that can be broken. Very often these attacks are of theoretical nature, and then they become proof of concepts. Sometimes you might wonder whether these attacks have been used in the wild, and to which extent have been used in the wild. But attacks on cryptography in the wild are nowhere near the attacks that you see in the wild, in the real world, against things like passwords, hardware, biometrics. So these things are definitely the weakest link in the cryptography chain. And of course, passwords, hardware, and biometrics. I mean, already when I was explaining this, when I was giving you examples of some of these, are not just used to protect keys. They're also often used to grant access to other resources. When I was talking about hardware, I mentioned the key used to enter your car. That's a hardware token which performs some kind of security function, but it's not there to protect a cryptographic key, right? But most of the principles behind these things are the same. So that's why, I mean, now when we're going to talk about passwords, hardware, and biometrics, we're going to talk about these things in general, not necessarily only in the context of protecting keys, but protecting resources in general. And the resource can be, cryptographic key, can also be the ability of logging into some system or to use some resource, and so on. So let's start with passwords. When we think about so what is a password? I mean, I guess everyone has used a password in their life, but passwords are short, low entropy secrets. The main characteristic of passwords is that they should be so short that humans can remember them in their mind. They're often a combination of characters and numbers and some of the special symbols you can type on your keyboard. And when you think about the passwords, there are 4 very important steps in the life of a password. So the first step is, how is the password chosen? If you don't choose good passwords, the adversary might be able to guess your password. Hand in hand with this goes the ability of the adversary to verify their guesses to a password. So if you have a resource that allows the users to input passwords manually, it might take 1 second to input a password, then you know that the adversary can try 1 password a second. The speed at which adversary can verify their guess and the hardness of guessing a password go together, right? So if you have, if it's very hard to guess a password, and it's very hard and it's low for an adversary to verify their guesses, then the system is very secure. But you might have a system in which guessing the password is not hazard, but then there are some restriction on how many times the password can be, the adversary can guess the password and verify it. And then maybe your system will still have a reasonable level of security, even if the password doesn't have the same level of entropy. As an example, if you have you could have a system which only allows to guess a password a few times and then self-destroys. Then even if the password is not very long, this might not be as much as a problem as if you have a system in which adversary can offline and using computing equipment verify password guesses, where the adversary maybe can check thousands or millions of passwords every second, and then the strength of the password becomes much more relevant. Anyway, we're going to say more about that later. After the user generates a password, then the user has to store a password. And of course, passwords are secrets which are meant to be stored in the user's head, but to a larger degree, passwords are also stored on devices. So users are tired of inputting passwords every time they need to access some resource. So it's not uncommon to save passwords on your machine or on your phone, or to have passwords. So for instance, when you log in, when you use a Wi-Fi network, you don't input the password every time. The password for the Wi-Fi is stored in the machine. So of course, the way in which the password is stored, it's important on the user side, and therefore the question how hard it is for the adversary to steal the password from the user storage. And I mean, now I'm talking about digital storage, but it could also be like, you have your password stored in your wallet or on a post-it on your screen. Another critical phase in the life of a password is the transmission of the password between the user and the verifier. And here, the concept of user and verifier can change a lot in different applications. In an online setting, the user is when you log in on your email account, the user is you or your laptop. The verifier is your email provider, and transmitting the password is actually sending the password over the internet. And therefore, you have to worry about how is the password transmitted and whether the adversary can eavesdrop it and steal it there and transmit. But you can also have the setting in which you're using an ATM, or in general, you're paying with your credit card, and you're being asked to input the PIN code, and then the transmission of the password is simply you typing on some device, typing your PIN code. In that case, the transmission of the password is simply you typing on the device, and then the question is, can the adversary eavesdrop this password either by physically looking at you, or maybe recording what you're doing with the PIN code machine, or maybe the PIN code machine itself being under the control of the adversary, saving the things you're typing. Finally, the password also needs to leave, some form of the password, some function of the password must leave also on the verifier side. Otherwise, the verifier will not be able to verify that the password input is correct. So there is, of course, also a question of how is the password stored at the verifier side and whether the adversary can steal it. So now there are two places in which a password is stored, the user and the verifier, and these two are treated separately because there is a big difference between storage at the user side, where typically the user must store the password itself, and storing at the verifier side, where the verifier doesn't necessarily need to store the password, but might store some function of the password which is enough to verify that the password which is being input is correct. This is going to become more concrete later. So the first step was choosing a password. So typically users choose, there are different ways of doing this. In many cases, in many common cases, the user is simply asked to choose a password. When registering on the website, users can pick their password. In other settings, the password is chosen for the users by some service provider. For instance, in some cases, the bank will send you a credit card and will also tell you what the PIN code associated to this credit card is. So you don't get to choose your PIN code. And of course, there are pros and cons with any of these solutions. you can imagine, you can expect users to be worse at picking good passwords than if the password or the PIN code is picked by a machine which is in the control of the of some entity. On the other hand, it's for the user might be much harder for the user to remember something that they didn't choose compared with something that they choose themselves. Of course, if the user chooses the password or the PIN code themselves, there is a higher risk of the user reusing the same password across different services, which is not a good idea. Whereas if the password or the PIN code is chosen by someone else for the user will have be a much lower chance that this password is being reused. So there are pros and cons with either. But in any case, regardless of these, even if the user chooses the password uniformly at random, passwords are still weak secrets because they're short. So studies have shown that users can't really remember passwords that are more than 12 characters long. And most services and most users use passwords which are 8 characters. So this is changing, and in some places we're being asked to use longer passwords. But let's consider in this example an 8-character password. So if you even assume that the user chooses the password uniformly at random, how many possible passwords are there? So if we consider here an 8-character password where every character can either be a letter, uppercase or lowercase, a number, or one of the common special characters which can be typed on a keyboard, regardless of how you count this, the number of possible symbols that you can use in a password is less than 128. And this means that therefore the number of possible passwords that the user can choose is 2 to the 56. And this is an insanely smaller number when you compare it with the number of possible AES keys. So the strength of a password is way less than the strength of a cryptographic key such an AES key. Meaning that, so 2 to the 56, it's a number that coincidentally 2 to the 56 was also the number of keys that you could choose in DES, the data encryption standard, which, as we discussed when we were talking about confidentiality, is a completely broken crypto system because modern computers can perform 2 to the 56 operations, or they can try all keys in a reasonably slow time. So this is an issue for passwords. The fact that passwords are weak secret means that we need to address this problem. Another problem with choosing passwords is that users do not choose passwords at random. And studies have shown that passwords like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 8 are much more likely to be chosen than a uniformly random password. On top of this, because of this, adversaries or in general the security community, both white hat and black hats, have built dictionary of passwords over the years. It's very easy to find online large databases of common passwords. More or less every year there is at some point there is some press release saying here are the 10 most popular passwords for this year, and it's always quite depressing to see what the passwords are, right? Because there are very few passwords which are chosen by many users. And using these dictionary attacks, so using these dictionaries, using these passwords dictionaries, attackers can break into systems with a much higher probability than they were just trying to choose passwords at random. So instead of, if the adversary has 1,000 guesses, if the adversary wants, to try to break into a system, they will not start by just picking around the password, but they will just start using the list from the most common password and downwards. And this will give them a huge advantage. On top of this, you can also have a smarter dictionary. So I mean, a dictionary attack today is not just trying the most common passwords, but it's going to be also trying almost the most common passwords with variation. So I mean, if baseball is a very common password, you will not only try baseball, but you will also try baseball where you replace the A with a 4, because that's a very common substitution that users do when they're asked to when they're forced to input to mix characters with numbers, you would replace the L with a 1, and you would do things like this. You will try to concatenate different passwords. You would try to put some special symbols at the beginning and at the end of the passwords. So you would not only try common passwords, you also try easy variations on common passwords. And doing so will allow attackers to break into passwords much, much faster than if they were trying uniformly at random. Studies have been made showing how hard or easy it is to guess passwords chosen by users. And here it's also important to remember that you might think, maybe this is not a problem for me because I am a very, I'm a security-aware individual. I know how to choose a good password. But in many cases, the goal of the attacker is not to break into your necessarily into your account. Maybe the attacker is happy enough into breaking into some account. So often it is enough to break into. It might be enough to break. Maybe the attacker wants to gain some credential into some company, into some system. Then it's not really important to break into a specific individual account. It might be enough to break into anyone's. And there again, this problem that the system is as weak as its weakest link, and therefore, a dictionary attack provides a very useful tool. As an alternative to passwords, which are easy to guess and hard to remember, many security researchers advocate users to drop passwords and use passphrases instead. So again, I'm going to use an XKCD comic here that shows that, if you force users to choose a secure password, meaning a password which contains uppercase letters and lowercase letters and numbers and symbols, many users will choose passwords which follow a pattern. For instance, some word, and then do some substitution of letters with numbers into the word, picking some caps over the password, perhaps adding some numbers and some symbols at the end to satisfy the format of the password. And here, there is an estimate of how many bits of entropy this password has, or in other words, how many possible passwords you can build using this pattern. And these passwords are hard to remember, as anyone might have experienced. It's not very easy to remember where you put the caps and where you didn't put the caps. It's not very easy to remember where you substituted the O with a 0 and where you didn't substitute the O with a 0. So when typing this password, maybe especially after a long period of time, might be hard to remember the exact format of the password. So such a password is, to some extent, hard to remember and still not very hard to guess. So what many security researchers advocate instead is to use passphrases where you pick a number of words which are easier to remember for you because they carry a meaning. And if you pick these words at random, then you can create a password which is stronger than what you would do like this, but that is harder, but it's easier to remember. Of course, such a password might not be accepted by systems which enforce the policy on the user that says that you need to have uppercase and lowercase and numbers and symbol and whatnot. So here there is a struggle between the research and practices. There is also another struggle is between asking users to pick, as we have seen in the previous lecture, every secret becomes less secret the more you use. The same also is true for passwords. So especially a few years ago, it was very common practice to ask users to change their passwords all the time or very, very frequently. And research has shown that doing so actually can be decremental for security when we talk about passwords, because if you ask users to change password very often, then users will get frustrated and then get into bad routines or bad habits to choose weak passwords. For instance, if you ask the user to change password often, they might just pick the same password and then add a number. So the next password is just the previous password, and then with some counter which increases, or some silly method like that, which means that then you just get the perceived, you might get a perceived feeling of security, but you really don't, because the new passwords are just very easily guessable given the older password. So there isn't really any benefit in changing the password more often. You just make life harder for users. But these, I mean, so the topic of passwords is incredibly interesting, and guessing password and how you should guess password, and how you should, what are the policies you should have around passwords. This is a very exciting topic, which is not only a topic that for cryptographers or for the more technical or mathematical side of computer security, but of course involves research in user-computer experience, human-computer interaction, psychology, and whatnot. Another thing which is important to talk about when we talk about passwords is password verification. So here the question is, how many times should a user be allowed to insert an incorrect password? Here you have a trade-off, which is the following. So if you allow unlimited or too many attempts at passwords, at inputting a password, this opens the door for an adversary to do a brute force of the password. On the other hand, if you put some restriction that limit this, severely limits the number of attempts at a wrong password that the user can input, this can first of all lead to frustrating experience for the user, who can lock themselves out of the system, or can even be exploited by the adversary to mount a denial of service attack. So if your iPhone, if you set there is an option on iPhones which completely erases everything on your iPhone after 10 wrong attempts at inputting the password. I mean, if you enable this option, this of course gives you great security. I mean, if someone steals your iPhone, they will have, I mean, if you have a password which is any good, 10 attempts are not very many for them to be able to brute force the password. But of course, on the other hand, you open the door for someone who very briefly has access to your iPhone to completely destroy all the content that you have on your iPhone by simply inputting a wrong password for 10 times. So this is a very tricky trade-off, and it's really, and I mean, there is no one solution that fits every situation. In some situations, you really availability is more important than security, and therefore you can't have self-destruct solutions. In other settings, secrecy is more important than availability, so you must have a solution with these kind of self-destruct features, which after a few attempts locks the users completely out. In many cases, a good trade-off is slowing down the number of attempts that an adversary can do. So if you just slow down the number of attempts that an adversary can do, you will only marginally affect honest users. So if you increase the password verification time from 1 microsecond to 1 second, this might not be a very big problem for an honest user who has to log in, once a day. But on the other hand, going from 1 microsecond to 1 second if you allow, instead of allowing 1 attempt per second, you allow 1 attempt per microsecond, you give an incredibly high amount of attempts to an adversary who might be trying to brute force your password. So to slow down, so this idea of slowing down the verification process can be done in 2 ways. So the first one that can be used for any system that uses password is to make verification slow on purpose. So simply, so simply instead of allowing, one verification per microsecond, you allow one verification per second. Now this simply limits the number of attempts that an adversary can perform, which is a small price for the user. The other idea, which only works for online systems, so systems which are reacting, so where there is some kind of logic behind it, is to make verification increasingly slow every time the password is entered correctly. So for instance, if you input the password incorrectly the first time, then you can input it immediately right afterwards, because a user might have simply mistyped the password. But if you keep inputting the wrong password, then you're going to put the user you're going to give the user some waiting period. Maybe you start with 10 seconds and then you give them 1 minute or something like that. And then of course this can be a bit frustrating for the user, but it's much better than being locked out of the system, and makes the life of the adversary very, very, very hard. Storing password in transmission. So storing password in transmission is a very common way of storing passwords. So this is something which has been very popular for ATM machines and PIN codes. So here on the right, you can see some pictures of devices that an attacker can install on top of an ATM machine. So this is a fake keyboard that is on top of the real keyboard, which records what the user is typing as the user is typing it. And yet there is like a card reader which is being installed on top of the real card reader, which reads your magnetic stripe, and therefore completely steals your credit card information and your PIN code. A more modern version of this, which unfortunately has been also used here in Denmark to steal people's passwords for their NemID systems, is to install keyloggers in public libraries or other public computers that are accessed by people to access their NemID or other systems. So you can of course steal the password in transmission, while it's being typed, but you can of course also steal the password in transmission, as in while it's actually being transmitted over the internet. So this is this has been done and this being done if you're using non-encrypted connections. So this can be because you are connecting to a website which doesn't use HTTPS but only uses HTTP. So non-encrypted. This is getting less and less common, but there are still websites out there that don't use encryption. And also when you use public Wi-Fi's, where everyone who's connected to the same Wi-Fi has access to the same data. So attackers have been known to sit in cafes, Starbucks or whatnot, and wait for other users to use the free Wi-Fi to access their email accounts or other services where they needed to use their password, and simply eavesdrop their passwords from the Wi-Fi. So stealing passwords in transmission can be a very good way of stealing the password for the attacker. And of course, the main solution against this is to use encryption. There isn't very much to do about the password being stolen as you type it. Here, of course, I mean, the advice is not to only type your password on your own machine, but this is not an advice that everyone can follow. For instance, if they don't have a computer at home and then you must use public computers. And of course, this is definitely an advice you cannot follow when you use a credit card and you're using devices that you might not be familiar with. Another place where you can steal the password is at the user side. So when the user stores the password. And this can take different forms. So one form is stealing the password from the memory of the user. This is what is usually known as social engineering. So simply getting the user to tell you their password. This can be done, for instance, by sending emails to users and telling them, this is an email from your bank. Please click on this link, or please reply to this email with your password. Otherwise, your bank account is going to get locked. And while fewer and fewer people reply to this kind of emails, as the general public is getting more and more aware of this kind of attacks. This is still an attack which has had way too high success rates in previous years and still is successful. Another attack is phishing, which is a different format of social engineering where you're redirecting the user to a web page that looks like the web page that the user wanted to log in. So for instance, you make a fake web page that looks very similar to the web page of some big banks, and then you redirect the users to your home page, and then you ask them to, and then the users will input passwords in your on your website. So this is known as phishing, and again, this is an attack which is unfortunately very successful. Other ways of stealing passwords from the users are via malware. I mean, you might get infected by malware. We will talk more about malware in another chapter, but malware is viruses or Trojan software. So this is malicious software that you might get installed on your machine by accident, maybe because you are installing some software that you don't know where it comes from and also carries this malware, or maybe simply because there is some vulnerability in your machine which is being exploited by the malware to spread itself from machine to machine. If you have malware on your machine, the malware might be stealing your password either as you type the password on your machine in the form of a keylogger, so some software that steals password while you type them, or might steal them from the storage, right? The malware might have access to your hard disk and check where the password is. And this is also why, of course, password, if you have a password which is stored on your machine and the password is stored unencrypted, you're essentially trusting any software. I mean, you must trust software running on your machine not to eavesdrop these passwords and not to try to steal passwords from you. This is a good time to take a short break, and I'll see you in a little bit in the next video.